Someone deliberately drilled holes into my houseboat, and now I'm watching it slowly sink while the president of the homeowners association stands nearby, fake crying to the police about some made-up environmental crisis. If that sounds ridiculous, just wait till things only get stranger from here. Ever seen someone go full dictator over a lake? You're about to. This woman genuinely believes she's the sheriff, the judge, and the environmental agency all rolled into one. Me? I was just trying to live quietly and build boats. Spoiler alert, that didn't sit well with her. If you've ever had to deal with nonsense or a neighbor with way too much power, let me know in the comments. I need to know I'm not the only one. It all began on a calm afternoon in late June. I was on the deck of my houseboat, sanding a new railing section I had recently installed. The sun was brutal, but a steady breeze from the lake made it bearable. For 3 months now, I'd been rebuilding my boat and my life after returning to my grandfather's old ranch to restart my boat building business. The lake was as clear and peaceful as ever, fed by a spring that kept it pristine year-round. I was just admiring how perfect the spot was when I heard the distinct sound of high heels clicking on gravel. That noise didn't belong out here in ranch country. Looking up, I saw a woman in a bright white business suit picking her way down the dusty trail. She looked like the type who'd fire her landscaper for planting the wrong color flowers. Even at a distance, it was obvious she had probably spent more on her shoes than most people do on a decent used car. She stopped just short of my property line, around 20 feet from where my houseboat was anchored, and stood there glaring at me like I was some kind of zoo exhibit. I set my sandpaper down and gave a casual wave, assuming she was curious about the construction. That assumption couldn't have been more wrong. "Excuse me," she called out in a sharp, icy voice. "Are you the one responsible for that structure?" She pointed at my houseboat like it was radioactive. I stood up, wiped my hands on my shirt, and walked closer to the edge of the deck so I could respond properly. "Yes ma'am, I built it myself," I said with a polite smile. "Still a work in progress, but she's coming along." "I'm Austin Turner. By the way, you must be new around here. I don't think we've met." My attempt at friendliness didn't faze her. In fact, she looked even more annoyed. "I'm Paula Greaves, president of the Sunset Hills Homeowners Association," she said, like she was announcing royalty. "That floating scrap heap is a complete eyesore and a violation of community code. It needs to be removed immediately." I couldn't help but chuckle a little at the absurdity. My family had owned this land for generations, and now some stranger was telling me my perfectly legal boat didn't meet her standards? "Well, Ms. Greaves, I appreciate the concern," I replied, still trying to keep the peace. "But this lake is on private ranch land, my family's ranch, to be exact. I don't believe your HOA rules apply out here." Her face flushed crimson, and a vein in her forehead started to twitch. Clearly, she wasn't used to hearing the word no, especially from someone she saw as just a small-town rancher. "Listen here, Turner," she snapped, her tone turning aggressive. "I don't care about your sentimental stories. This community has standards, and your little floating project doesn't meet them. If you won't take it down willingly, I'll use legal means to force it." With every word, she gestured angrily toward the houseboat, her finger jabbing the air as though she could physically erase it. Sweat was beginning to trickle down her temple, and her salon-perfect hair was starting to fall apart. It was clear this wasn't about rules or aesthetics. This was a woman desperate for control. I exhaled slowly, trying one last time to reason with her. "Ma'am, I get that you're trying to protect your neighborhood, but this land is private. I'm not bothering anyone. I just want to work and live quietly." But she wasn't listening. She whipped out her phone and began snapping photos of my houseboat from every angle, mumbling something about gathering evidence. When she finally lowered her phone, she gave me a look so cold it could freeze a lake. "Turner," she said, "you're about to find out I don't back down. I've handled people like you before, and I always win. You have 48 hours to start taking that thing apart or face the consequences." With that, she spun on her heel and marched off, her high heels sinking into the soft dirt as she made her way back up the trail. I watched her go, feeling half amused, half dumbfounded by the whole bizarre encounter. Once she was out of sight, I looked back at my houseboat gently rocking in the water, then out across the vast trench that stretched in every direction. I had a sinking feeling, and not just because of the boat. Paula Greaves wasn't going away quietly. The breeze was calm, the lake still, but I could sense it as a real storm had just arrived, and it came wearing designer heels. The days that followed were pure psychological warfare. Each morning brought a new unpleasant surprise: slashed ropes, scattered tools, or claw marks gouged into the boat's hull. Paula had turned sabotage into a full-time hobby. Every day I woke up racing for what mess I'd find next, and every day she delivered. Her creativity in chaos could have earned her a Medal A if military generals cared about petty neighbor feuds and minor vandalism. Then came the phone calls. They started that Thursday and quickly became a daily source of torment. She started calling daily, like it was her full-time job, quoting obscure HOA bylaws like gospel. She'd leave voicemail after voicemail until I finally stopped answering. Somewhere around message number 6, the nearest neighbor was half a mile away, and not one of them had ever complained. But Paula wasn't fueled by logic, she was driven by fixation. By day 3 of this insanity, I was getting the eerie sense that I was constantly being watched. Every time I stepped outside to work on the boat, that creeping feeling would crawl up the back of my neck, like eyes were locked on me from a distance. And they were. I looked toward the southern ridge that bordered my property, and there she was, Paula, standing atop the hill like some kind of suburban sniper, silently observing, judging, prowling. It was beyond unnerving, it was invasive. The tipping point came on Saturday morning. I stepped out of the house to find Tom Bradley parked in my driveway, leaning against his pickup truck, looking visibly uneasy. Tom had been working the land next to ours since before I was old enough to drive. He was dependable, low-key, the kind of guy who'd show up with fence wire and a thermos without being asked. Seeing him rattled was a red flag. "Austin," he said, removing his faded ball cap and dragging a hand through his graying hair, "hate to be the one to say it, but you need to know what's going on." He told me Paula had been spinning wild tales around town, accusing me of polluting the lake, attracting pests, and secretly constructing something sinister. Thanks to her rumors, half the neighborhood thought I was running a moonshine operation or digging a survivalist bunker by the water. Most folks weren't buying it, thankfully, but she'd still managed to stir up the more gullible ones. According to Tom, she was parading around with some kind of legal paperwork, claiming she'd reported me to various government offices for water contamination and unauthorized development. "I don't know what her angle is," Tom said with concern in his voice, "but she's clearly building a case." As he drove off, promising to keep me informed, I wandered down to the lake and sat on the edge of my houseboat's deck, trying to wrap my head around everything. This wasn't just a fussy neighbor with control issues anymore. Paula was running a full-blown smear campaign against me, filing what sounded like fraudulent reports and trying to get me booted from my own land. I remembered something my grandfather used to say about standing your ground when it came to family property, but I wasn't ready for an all-out war, not yet. Instead, I decided to try a different approach. Maybe, just maybe, if she believed she was winning, she'd back off. The next morning, I put on a little show, disassembling parts of the railing on my houseboat and stacking them neatly on shore, making it look like I was preparing to take the whole thing down. I even left a few loose boards and tools lying around, just to sell the act. Sure enough, within the hour, I spotted Paula at her usual perch, grinning ear to ear and snapping photos like she just witnessed a personal victory. To her, it looked like I was finally caving. But that fake surrender came back to bite me. Instead of easing off, Paula took my staged compliance as confirmation that her strategy was effective, and she cranked everything up a notch. The calls became more frequent, more hostile. The sabotage went from petty vandalism to actual damage: ropes cut clean through, boards smashed. And her surveillance wasn't even subtle anymore. I couldn't step outside without feeling like I was being watched, because I had made a serious miscalculation. I thought pretending to give in would buy me some space, but all it did was show a predator that I was bleeding. Just as I was starting to work out a real plan, one that didn't involve psychological games, my phone rang again. I almost ignored it, assuming it was Paula with another sanctimonious rant about imaginary violations, but the caller ID read Tom Bradley, which was odd. considering he had just left my place less than a half hour ago. "Austin," Tom said, his voice tight with urgency, "Paula just passed my place. She's heading your way, and she's not alone. Looks like she brought someone in an official-looking vehicle. I think she might have brought some kind of inspector." I thanked him, hung up, and looked out across the lake at the calm, glassy water that had been in my family for generations. This land had been in my family for generations, and Paula Greaves was about to learn that I wasn't some timid city boy who'd crumble under pressure. But before I confronted her, I had a phone call to make, one that would turn out to change everything. Though I didn't know it at the time, I reached out to the law firm that had handled my grandfather's estate, thinking they'd have access to the original documents showing our property lines. What I expected to be a simple boundary check turned into a discovery that shifted the entire power dynamic between Paula and me. The attorney said she'd need to dig through the old archives to locate the original land grants and deeds, but promised to get back to me within 48 hours with a complete survey and ownership history. I figured having that kind of official documentation on hand would come in useful, especially if Paula managed to drag some government inspector onto my land. While I waited to hear back from the lawyer, I decided to do a little digging of my own. Inside the house, tucked away in an old cedar chest, were the family's important documents. The same chest my grandfather had used to store everything from maps to letters. Inside, I found hand-drawn maps marked in fading ink, old surveys stamped by long-gone clerks, and a pile of weathered papers that told a much bigger story than I expected. My kitchen table quickly filled with these documents, and as I laid them out and pieced things together, it became clear, our property wasn't just a little slice of land by the water, it was a vast piece of the countryside, and the lake, along with a significant portion of the surrounding land, was still part of that claim. My great-great-grandfather had secured nearly 800 acres, including full water rights. While parts of the ranch had been sold over the years, the lake had always remained in the family. If the papers were accurate, and judging by the official government seals and signatures, they were, then Paula's home sat right on the edge of our land, but the lake itself, and everything around it for hundreds of yards, was still mine. Between those maps and deeds, I found something else, a single page torn from my grandfather's journal. The writing was shaky, but the message couldn't have been clearer. "Protect what's yours. They'll always come for what they didn't build." He'd written it during a dispute with neighboring ranchers back in the 60s, but it might as well have been aimed at my current situation. He knew firsthand how people could try to take what wasn't theirs, and he knew the importance of standing your ground. When the lawyer finally called back the next afternoon, her voice had a tone of someone reading from both a legal brief and a history book. "Austin," she said, with barely concealed astonishment, "your great-great-grandfather was a shrewd operator. Not only did he stake the original homestead, but he purchased additional water rights directly from the territorial government before Oklahoma was even a state." She paused, then added, "Your family owns the lake, the water, the lakebed, and everything up to 200 yards beyond the shoreline. Legally, no one else has any claim to it." Then, with what sounded like professional respect, she said, "This is one of the most solid property cases I've ever reviewed. The documentation is ironclad, over a century of ownership, properly recorded and archived. There's no room for dispute." I thanked her and hung up, thinking hard. Now that I had proof, rock solid, legally documented proof, I had a choice to make. I could confront Paula immediately and shut down her nonsense once and for all, or a broken bar I could wait. Let her continue pushing, lying, overreaching. There was a part of me that wanted her to keep digging herself deeper. After everything, the threats, the damage, the lies to my neighbors, I wanted her to be the one to fall on her own sword. She had treated me like some unlawful squatter, filed false environmental complaints, and slandered me across the entire community. Maybe it was time she learned what happens when you pick a fight without knowing who you're up against. I locked away the maps and deeds in a safe spot in the house, ready to be pulled out when the time was right. That evening, I sat on the deck of my houseboat as the sunset lit up the lake in brilliant gold and orange. I had made my decision. I would keep quiet for now, let her play her final cards. If she chose to escalate this any further, I'd be ready. And when the time came, The truth would not only stop her in her tracks, it would embarrass her in front of the entire community. She wasn't just picking on the wrong man, she was launching a crusade against someone who had every legal right to be there. As if she could read my thoughts, Paula made her next move the very next morning, her boldest one yet. I was halfway through my first cup of coffee when I heard the sound of vehicles rumbling down the gravel road toward my property. I looked out through the kitchen window. I spotted a small convoy approaching. Leading the pack was Paula's ever-present white sedan, followed by a pickup with government plates and a Fish and Wildlife Service vehicle. Somehow, she'd managed to rope in not one but multiple agencies to come investigate what she claimed were environmental violations. As the convoy rolled into my driveway, I couldn't help but smile at her persistence. She thought this was her moment of victory, but she was about to walk straight into a rude awakening. Still, I decided to let her savor her so-called triumph. The higher she climbed, the harder she'd fall when the truth came out. To my surprise, the officials she brought along were competent and level-headed. Among them were representatives from the Environmental Protection Agency, Fish and Wildlife, and the county's planning department. These weren't the type to be influenced by hysteria or personal vendettas. They were professionals who knew their jobs. I met them at the gate and welcomed them onto the property, encouraging them to inspect whatever they needed. I had nothing to hide because there was nothing wrong. Paula, however, was nearly trembling with glee, eagerly leading them toward the houseboat and spouting accusations about water contamination, ecological damage, and illegal structures. But as the team moved through the inspection testing the water, reviewing the site, examining my boat, her narrative quickly fell apart. The water was clean, the boat was up to code. Every claim she made was met with neutral observations and calm skepticism. Still, she pressed on, growing increasingly frantic. There has to be something wrong. She kept insisting. He's clearly violating some law. Her desperation became more transparent by the minute, and I could see the agents growing irritated with her constant interruptions and baseless claims. Eventually, the officials regrouped in my driveway to discuss their findings. The environmental specialist spoke first, confirming that the lake was pristine, even cleaner than most others in the region thanks to its spring-fed source. Then the county representative delivered the final blow. My houseboat fully complied with all regulations for temporary residential structures on private land. No permits were needed, no codes had been violated. In short, every accusation Paula had thrown at me had been thoroughly investigated, and none of them held any merit. The look on Paula's face was priceless. She cycled through confusion, rage, disbelief like a short-circuited traffic light. "That's impossible," she cried. "There have to be violations. You're just not looking hard enough." The officials responded calmly, explaining that their assessment was complete and no legal or environmental concerns had been found. That's when Paula turned her fury on me. "This isn't over, Turner," she growled, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If the system won't stop you, I will. You have no idea what you've started." The officials exchanged uneasy glances. That threat didn't go unnoticed. For most people, that would have been the end. But not Paula. Instead of retreating, she dug in deeper. More phone calls, more staring contests from her parked car at the edge of my property. Her behavior only grew more unhinged over the next 3 days. My quiet ranch had turned into a psychological battlefield. She'd sit for hours in her car, just watching the houseboat through binoculars like some deranged neighborhood watch captain turned stalker. Then came the final straw. It was a Tuesday morning in late July. I'd stayed up late the night before finishing the cabin interior of my houseboat. I decided to sleep on board a test run for the ventilation system and new bedding. Just after dawn, I woke to strange voices and the whir of machinery coming from shore. When I peered through the cabin window, I saw Paula on my dock accompanied by 2 unfamiliar men, rough-looking guys in dirty work clothes, and definitely not the type you'd associate with official inspections. One carried a battery-powered drill. The other had a toolbox filled with gear that looked more like demolition equipment than anything else. I bolted upright, threw on my clothes, and sprinted outside just in time to see one of them drill straight into the hull of my houseboat, just below the waterline. "Hey!" I shouted. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" The man with the drill froze, clearly caught in the act. His partner started backing off toward shore. "Paula, meanwhile, stepped forward, smiling with a twisted kind of pride, a mix of madness and gloating satisfaction. "Just running a few additional tests, Turner," she said coolly. "We need to make sure your little structure is seaworthy. I wouldn't want it floating loose during a storm, would we?" As she spoke, I could already see water beginning to seep through the holes they had drilled. My heart dropped. The boat was taking on water fast. What followed was chaos, a shouting, splashing, scrambling for anything I could use to patch the damage. I jumped into the lake and tried to plug the holes with whatever was within reach. Meanwhile, Paula's hired goons were packing up and making a hasty retreat to their truck, clearly eager to disappear before things escalated further. But the damage was done. It was too much, too fast. My houseboat, the one I'd poured months of work into, was sinking before my eyes, standing waist deep in the lake. I managed to salvage a waterproof container from the cabin. Inside were my grandfather's old journals and a stack of family photographs. It was all I could save as the houseboat continued to sink before my eyes. Just as I emerged from the water, soaked and furious, I heard Paula on the dock, already dialing her phone. Her voice rang out through the still morning air, all theatrical concern and fake urgency. "Yes, I need to report an environmental emergency," she said. "There's a man here who intentionally sank a boat in our community lake. It's leaking fuel and chemicals. You need to send someone right away to arrest him." That was the moment something shifted in me. Up until then, I'd viewed this whole mess as an extreme neighbor dispute, one that could be handled through patience, paperwork, and legal process. But watching Paula not only destroy my property but then immediately frame me for it in a blatant lie, that was criminal, and she had officially crossed the line. The anger that settled in me wasn't loud or explosive. It was focused, cold, and crystal clear, the kind that comes when you finally understand exactly who you are dealing with. By the time Officer Mike Stevens pulled into my driveway about 20 minutes later, I'd had enough time to get my thoughts straight. Mike was a good man, mid-30s, born and raised in the area. He knew my family. In fact, he'd even helped my grandfather out during a cattle rustling issue some years back. If anyone could approach this situation without bias, it was him. Paula, on the other hand, had worked herself into a full-blown performance. She looked practically gleeful as Mike stepped out of his cruiser. "Officer Stevens," she said, voice full of self-righteous energy, "thank you for responding so quickly. As you can see, this man has deliberately sunk an illegal structure into our community lake. I have multiple witnesses who saw him drilling holes in the hull. He's polluting the water and damaging shared property. I've tried for weeks to handle this civilly, but now he's escalated things to environmental sabotage. I expect you to arrest him immediately." She delivered this like she was presenting an airtight case in front of a jury. Her confidence was so complete, I almost had to admire it. Almost. Mike listened quietly, nodding as Paula recited her version of events. Then he turned to me with a steady, professional tone. "Austin," he said, "mind telling me your side of what happened this morning?" I nodded, took a breath, and opened the waterproof box. From inside, I pulled the plastic folder containing all the legal documentation my lawyer had helped prepare. Though I was still dripping from the lake, the documents inside were perfectly preserved. "Mike," I said as I handed him the folder, "before I explain anything else, I think you should take a look at these. They might put this entire situation into perspective." He opened the folder and began flipping through the contents. Old land grants, notarized deeds, government-sealed surveys. As he read, I noticed a shift in his expression, curiosity turning into surprise, and then quiet realization. Paula saw it too. Her confidence started to falter. "These are legitimate documents," Mike finally said. "Notarized, registered, and clearly show ownership going back generations. According to these records, the entire lake, every inch of it, sits on his family's land, which means none of this falls under your HOA's jurisdiction." He turned to Paula, his tone now noticeably firmer. "Ma'am, if these records check out, and from what I'm seeing, they absolutely do, and you've been filing false complaints about land that doesn't legally belong to your community. That's a serious misuse of public resources." The transformation on Paula's face was stunning. All the poise and authority she'd projected over the last few weeks collapsed in a matter of seconds. Her mouth opened, then closed, as she scrambled for a response. That can't be right," she stammered, reaching out like she could snatch the documents away. "The lake's always been considered public. It's common knowledge. He can't just show up and claim ownership with some old papers." But the tremor in her voice betrayed her doubt. For the first time, she wasn't entirely sure she was right. "Those aren't just old papers," Mike said, holding up one of the deeds. "These have verifiable survey stamps, official registration numbers, and historical records that date back well over 100 years. That's clear, legal ownership." He turned back to me, more serious now. "Austin, I understand you said there was more to explain about what happened this morning. Given what I now know about the land, I'd like to hear everything from your side." When Officer Stevens asked for my account of what had happened that morning, specifically how my houseboat ended up at the bottom of the lake, I laid it all out. From the moment I saw the two men on my dock, to the sound of a drill piercing the hull, to Paula's phony 911 call, the shift in Stevens' demeanor was immediate and stark. Moments earlier, he'd been calm and professional with Paula, but now he was staring at her like a suspect under investigation, because, by any definition, that's exactly what she had become. "Ma'am," he said, his tone sharp and unmistakably serious, "if what Mr. Turner is describing is true, we're looking at criminal charges: destruction of property, trespassing, and filing a false police report. These are not minor offenses. We're talking jail time and significant penalties. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Paula tried to bluff her way out, but her story unraveled with every sentence. She contradicted herself, dodged questions, and only made things worse. It was obvious to everyone watching that she was starting to understand just how deep she'd gotten herself. While Officer Stevens took notes and wrapped up his visit, Paula made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "Even if those property records are real," she said, her voice cracking with something that sounded a lot like panic, "he's been deceiving our entire community. That's fraud, or misrepresentation, or something illegal, right?" Mike looked at her like she'd just accused a neighbor of witchcraft. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "a property owner has no legal obligation to disclose the extent of his holdings to the public. What you're describing sounds more like intimidation, trying to force someone off land they rightfully own through false claims and public harassment." Paula's composure cracked. As her face fell, I felt a strange combination of satisfaction and sympathy. She had thrown everything she had into ruining me, and now, the weight of her own actions was crashing down. Stevens assured me a full report would be filed and that criminal charges were very likely. He also suggested I reach out to my insurance company about the damage to my houseboat and consider filing a restraining order against Paula. His patrol car disappeared up the road soon after, leaving just the two of us by the lake. She turned to me, face pale, eyes burning with something between rage and humiliation. "This isn't over, Turner," she spat. "I'll make sure everyone in this community sees you for what you really are. By the time I'm finished, you'll wish you'd never set foot here." And she meant every word of it. Paula's threat to destroy my reputation wasn't some idle outburst. She attacked my name with the same obsessive fervor she had used to attack my houseboat. Within 2 days of Officer Stevens' visit, my phone was buzzing with calls from neighbors I barely knew, all asking about what they'd heard had happened at the lake. It didn't take long to realize Paula was calling everyone in the HOA, spinning carefully constructed lies, trying to paint me as some kind of manipulative outsider who'd tricked the entire community. She suggested I was hiding my identity, or pretending to be someone I wasn't. Her campaign was coordinated, methodical, and relentless. She even started a group message thread, allegedly for community safety updates, that she used as a hub for spreading rumors and fabricated stories. Since I wasn't part of the HOA, I had no access to it, but thankfully, Tom Bradley kept me informed. According to him, the rumors ranged from the ridiculous to the borderline slanderous. She called me a fraud, a squatter, a threat to community values. Some of it was laughable, like claiming I was secretly building a water park, but other parts were more insidious. She twisted pieces of truth just enough to make her lies believable. Yes, I was relatively new to the area. Yes, I had recently produced historical documents showing my family's ownership of the lake. But Paula described those as mysterious papers that had suddenly appeared, implying I'd forged or fabricated them. It was just enough truth to lend her lies an air of credibility. The harassment went digital too. Paula got hold of my phone number and shared it liberally. She encouraged people to call me directly to ask questions about my supposed plans. Most callers were polite, just curious, but some were outright hostile, accusing me of things like environmental crimes or running an illegal business operation. Eventually, I had to disconnect my landline just to get some peace. I gave my cell number only to a few trusted people like Tom and Officer Stevens. Tom did everything he could to push back against Paula's narrative, but it was a steep uphill battle. She had no reputation left to protect, which made her dangerous, and she had nothing left to lose. A broken bar apparently had been taken from a handheld camera or low-end security setup. The image wobbled slightly at first, then stabilized to show a wide shot of the lake. In the video, I could be seen sleeping aboard my houseboat in the early dawn light, completely unaware of what was about to happen. Then, two men entered the frame, one of them carrying what now unmistakably looked like a power drill. A collective gasp rippled through the room. The camera zoomed in just enough to show one of the men kneeling down at the side of the boat, placing the drill against the hull below the waterline, while the other kept watch. Seconds later, the drill came to life, boring holes with precision and speed. From the shadows near the camera's position, Paula's voice could be faintly heard giving instructions, a cold, deliberate, and unmistakably hers. I didn't need to say a word. The silence in the clubhouse became thick, charged with disbelief and a growing undercurrent of outrage. A few people turned to look at me. Others stared at Paula, their expressions a mix of shock, anger, and something close to betrayal. She must not have reviewed the footage carefully, or perhaps she was so convinced of her own narrative that she thought people would only see what she wanted them to see. Either way, her plan had just detonated in her face. When the video ended, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then, someone near the front, a gray-haired man I didn't know, spoke up. "Mrs. Greaves," he said slowly, "are you telling us you thought this would prove he committed fraud?" Paula opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her confidence had evaporated. All that remained was the thin edge of panic clinging to her voice. It was taken out of context, she stammered. "He must have edited it, or he manipulated it." "No." Another voice cut in, at this time, a woman from the HOA board. "That was you giving orders. That was your camera. This doesn't just not prove your case, it proves his." The murmuring returned, louder now and full of unmistakable judgment. Paula looked around the room as if searching for someone to defend her, someone who still believed her version of events. But she found no allies. I stood again, keeping my voice calm but firm. "For weeks, I've been accused, harassed, slandered, and attacked, not just verbally but physically. My home was destroyed, and I was nearly arrested based on false claims. This video, it's not just a turning point, it's evidence. Evidence of exactly who has been behind all of this." Tom Bradley stood as well and nodded. "I've known Austin since he moved out here. I've seen the original deeds, I've seen the harassment, and now you've all seen it too." By the time the meeting ended, the entire tone of the neighborhood had shifted. Paula left quickly, avoiding eye contact. Her once commanding posture wilted under the weight of humiliation. No one followed her out. No one thanked her for organizing the meeting. Several residents approached me as I packed up my documents, offering quiet apologies, handshakes, even help rebuilding the houseboat. I accepted with appreciation, not because I needed vindication from them, but because it proved that decency still had a place in the community. That night, for the first time in weeks, I slept without worry. Paula had tried to destroy me, my name, my home, my peace, and in the end, she destroyed herself instead. The footage had clearly been shot from a distance, grainy, a little shaky, but clear enough. My houseboat floated peacefully at the dock while several figures moved across its deck. As the video played, Paula launched into her usual performance, providing commentary and insisting that what we were watching was proof that I had sabotaged my own boat to commit insurance fraud. But the video told a very different story. The figures on deck weren't acting like someone destroying their own property, they were too methodical, too coordinated. They drilled holes at precise spots below the waterline, working deliberately, not recklessly. And then, there she was, Paula, standing on the shore, checking her watch and barking orders. The camera angle caught her clearly and unmistakable. Then I appeared in the footage, sprinting down the dock, shouting. Her voice could be heard faintly in the background. "Hurry up and finish before he stops you." The room went completely silent. Everyone had just watched Paula, with her own evidence, prove beyond any doubt that she'd orchestrated the entire act of vandalism and framed me for it. The same woman who had spent weeks accusing me of environmental crimes and fraud had just shown the entire neighborhood video proof that she was the one guilty of it all. I stood, calm and steady. "As you've all just seen," I said, "Mrs. Greaves hired people to destroy my houseboat, then called the police to blame me for the crime she planned and executed. What you watched wasn't just harassment, it was criminal trespassing, destruction of private property, and filing a false police report." Paula tried to regain control, grasping for excuses. She claimed the video was doctored, said we were misinterpreting it but no one was buying it. Her voice cracked. Her lies, once smooth and confident, now stumbled over each other. Tom Bradley rose from the front of the room. "Mrs. Greaves," he said, his tone firm, "I think it's time you step down as HOA president. What we've witnessed tonight is a disturbing abuse of power and a complete betrayal of this community's trust." Someone called, "I second that," and a wave of voices followed. In seconds, it was official. Paula Greaves had just been voted out of the HOA by the very people she once manipulated. Several neighbors came up to me afterward, people who had believed her, or at least doubted me. They offered quiet apologies, thanked me for my patience, and admitted they'd been wrong. Officer Stevens, who'd been invited to observe the meeting, confirmed that the video would be critical evidence in the ongoing criminal investigation and said more charges were likely. Over the following weeks, justice moved swiftly. Paula was charged with multiple offenses: destruction of property, harassment, trespassing, and making false reports. She was fined, sentenced to community service, and given a restraining order. I sued her in civil court and won. The settlement covered the full cost of rebuilding my houseboat, plus damages. But more than that, it sent a message. Paula's standing in the neighborhood collapsed overnight. Her house went on the market within the month. She moved away without fanfare, leaving behind a community that had finally seen her for what she was. Peace returned to the lake. The new HOA president turned out to be fair and reasonable. We worked out an agreement that let neighbors fish a small section of shoreline while still respecting my family's land. Now, when I step onto the new houseboat rebuilt better than ever, I feel like the lake is smiling again. I still get letters from developers asking to buy a slice of the property, but I don't even bother responding. This land has been in my family for generations, and that's exactly how it's going to stay. Grandpa would have been proud. If you've ever dealt with someone like Paula Greaves, a neighbor who thinks intimidation can replace truth, I hope this story reminds you that justice can prevail, especially when you stand your ground and let the truth speak louder than the lies. Drop a comment below if you've had your own run-in with an HOA Karen. I'd love to hear your stories and your strategies for handling people who mistake bullying for authority. From whispers to wreckage, a broken bar, your stories brings it all. Click that next video if you can handle it.